This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello everyone. Tonight's show we'll be speaking to William Wadsworth, one of the UK's leading experts on revision strategies that work and the cognitive science behind them, as well as Banham on how this work has helped to enhance his students' progression. What works, what doesn't, what do students or teachers get wrong, what are the practical solutions teachers can use to help their students revise more effectively.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello everyone. It's great to be back after all this time. My first show in a couple of months. I'm Dave Brown, coming to you from a beautiful summer's night in Surrey. Big up to all the exam markers out there. I have just finished my quota today. If you've just finished or you're about to start GCSE and A-level markers, I salute you. Tonight I'm talking all things revision with William Wadsworth and Dale Banham. As a teacher myself, I know that getting students to revise more effectively is absolutely key to success in exams, and it's one of the aspects of my practice I've really tried to focus on over the past few years. So I'm really looking forward to speaking tonight to two people who are absolutely focused and knowledgeable on this key issue. We'll be looking at the cognitive science behind good revision, what works, what doesn't, what some of the blocks to student revision, and how we as teachers can work to encourage our students to be more effective with their revision. So my first guest tonight is William Wadsworth. Hopefully he's coming through okay. William, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dave. Thanks for having me on the show.
Fantastic to have you on. So I guess my first question is, William, just tell us a bit about your background and sort of your area of expertise.
Sure, and thank you very much again. I've been looking forward to this. I guess my kind of villain's origin story started back when I was a kid at school myself. I did pretty well in my own school exams, sort of 10 A stars at GCSE, 6 A's at A level, and I went on to get a first class degree in psychology from Cambridge. But the interesting thing was, for me, in hindsight, I could, I was obviously a reasonably capable student, but I could have saved myself a huge amount of time, particularly those GCSEs and A levels, if I'd known back then, even a fraction of what I now know about, the science of effective learning and how to apply it. But this stuff really isn't just for, high achievers. I think it's really a huge win for students of all kinds, all abilities. When we get revision right, when we get studying right, the gains in terms of not only our attainment, but also kind of how we feel along the way, our welfare, our stress levels. It's just so much better as a result of having the tools to learn well and do so in a time-efficient way. So my kind of career as exam study expert is about 7 years old now. So I've been doing this full time for around 7 years now, and I wear a number of different hats. So I'm a researcher for a good portion of the time, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the research I've done today. I also do quite a bit of talking in schools, both to staff and students, and I write blogs and podcast quite a bit. As well, so various things, all connected to this central mission of getting our students studying smarter, not necessarily harder.
Yeah, just before we get into the research, I'm just interested a bit more in your journey yourself. Like the way you told that was very quick. It sounded like it was all smooth sailing, but I'm assuming it wasn't. I mean, what got you interested in this particular field of psychology? Was it something that you had to overcome? Was it someone you saw yourself? It just seems an interesting field, in particular, like I guess what you call educational cognitive science. But what was it that made you sort of think, oh, this is an interesting aspect of cognitive science of psychology, revision? It just seems a very particular field.
It definitely. And look, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, everyone has their thing. And for whatever reason, my little thing has always just been, I just want to help people do well in exams, and I always have. Even back to, bless my little socks, 15-year-old me, after he'd taken his GCSEs, sitting down in that long summer post year 11, I started writing a little book about how to pass your exams. And I mean, it was terrible, Dave. Like, there was not a word of useful advice in there that I'd be proud of today. But I kind of had that seed. I had that interest. I wanted to help people with this stuff, and I was fascinated by any little tips or ideas I could find that might. Oh yeah, that's kind of a good idea. I can see that would help me. That might help other people. And so I'd kind of got that little seed, but then it really kind of fanned into a flame when I got to Cambridge, and I was obviously studying psychology. And getting exposed to what was then sort of the relatively new science of learning and kind of the cognitive psychology of how memory's formed and how we get stuff to stick in memory. And I started applying that to my own studying, and I mean, that application basically saved my degree. I would not have done very well at all. I mean, I might have even kind of been dropping out, kind of thing. Were it not for the fact that I started changing my study habits and using much more effective strategies. It was a night and day difference for me. One of the interesting things since then is that I was not very good at teaching this at first. I wanted to be. I really had that passion to share it, but I wasn't that good at it. I had a bit of one-on work stuff in the early days, and even some of my very early days of doing sort of workshop type things in schools. I look back on what I was doing then in those very early days. And, I now would nowhere near be proud of kind of the work I was doing back then. It was okay. But, I've just been really fascinated by kind of really trying to figure out how we get this message across to students so we can actually have an impact. Because ultimately that's the bit that really excites me. How can we actually convey this stuff in a way that gets people to change their behaviors and change their habits and has a positive impact on people? And what I've learned, I think one of the big things I've learned is, while the theory, I knew about the theory and kind of the theory is kind of increasingly mainstream and understood in the UK education world. I'm sure many listeners will be sort of familiar with the theoretical principles we'll be basing tonight's conversation on, but that practical application by students and the kind of almost the pedagogy of how we teach this to them is basically still in its infancy. And that's what I'm kind of really fascinated to figure out and try and refine and shape so we can help the next generation.
That's so interesting. You think it's in infancy. I want to get into that because the idea that there's so much more that might be explored. But let's get into the basis of your research. So can you explain to the listeners the research you've done, the amount of students you've looked at, how you put your basic overall study together?
Absolutely. So this started actually pre-COVID, and I was fascinated by this question of, okay, we're starting to get some quite good ideas now about what best practice looks like. We know the sorts of things our students should be aiming for, and in many cases, even back then, we started to talk to our students about what they should be doing and started to share that message with them. But the thing on my mind was, anecdotally, from talking to those students, I kind of had the sense that the message wasn't always landing. They might be aware of what to do, but they're not always doing it, or they're not always doing it consistently. And so I was curious about the extent to which best practice is common practice. That knowing doing gap that we sometimes talk about in education. You might know what to do, but are you actually doing it? And that can be quite a hard gap. And so I wanted to kind of measure that gap, and also understand, where there is a challenge for learners, just try and understand that a little bit better, and potentially try and come up with some solutions so we can help them move forward. So I reached out to Professor Henry Rödinger, one of the kind of great founding father scholars of the world of retrieval practice literature, one of the sort of top 10 most cited cognitive psychologists in history. He's the author of Make It Stick, by the way, if you've got that
yes,
light blue book with the gold star on the front.
I think I can see it on my shelf, yes.
So yeah, I reached out to Henry, or Roddy as he goes by, and I explained my interest, and we partnered together. We wrote a questionnaire. Him and his lab were very helpful in that experimental design. And then I went out and recruited schools to take part in the survey. It's basically a short questionnaire that asks students, how are you approaching your revision today? Is kind of the nub of it. And we've since surveyed around 60,000 students.
Wow.
So to my knowledge, there's no survey that comes anywhere close to that in terms of the scale of the data we've got to understand student study habits. So it's been a really fascinating bit of research, and it's sort of still ongoing. One of the nice things we've been able to do is kind of keep coming back to it year on year and see how things change over time.
So I guess from that study, let's start with the poor things students do. What would you say is the biggest myths or things that students get wrong when it comes to revision?
So there are quite a lot of differences between different schools on this. So, what I kind of will talk about is maybe kind of, I guess, the national average. But I think it's fair to say that there are some schools that are quite a bit further down the journey, and then there's others that are a bit sort of at an earlier stage in their journey where practice is not so good. So I guess kind of taking that national picture, we still see around 4 in 10 learners telling us that their main revision strategy is so the kind of the what, if they had to pick the one they use the most, is one we'd consider to be a less effective strategy. So principally things like rereading or just making notes, making summary notes. And we can talk about science of retrieval practice a bit more if you want, but I imagine many people listening to the show will kind of understand that that's not what the science says about the best practice in terms of how we want to be revising. So there's still quite a lot of students that kind of cling to old habits, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about why students maybe resist doing the retrieval practice. But that's kind of one of the headline findings. We can also do some interesting, we can sort of drill in a little bit more. So some of the kind of interesting sub-findings are things like when we look at flashcard use, for example. Now, flashcards in theory could be a really good way to do your retrieval practice, a great way to do your self-testing, potentially very, very effective. But I'm kind of interested always in the detail. The devil is in the detail with some of this. It's not just selecting a good strategy, but are you putting it into action? And so one of the kind of follow-up questions we ask with flashcards is kind of when it comes to your flashcard time, you're kind of focusing on just making them, writing them, or are you focusing on testing yourself with them? Or in some cases, are you just focusing on maybe just reading them back through? We maybe see about 10% of students just focusing on kind of reading the flashcards back through. So they've not quite got the point of why we do flashcards. It's a self-testing mechanism. And then the rest split kind of roughly 50-50 between those that are, focusing on the self-testing, which is what we want to see, of course, and then those that have kind of get stuck on the writing stage. So there's this kind of it's almost like this 3-level thing. Like there's this kind of, are you aware of what you want to do in the first place? And as I say, it's a kind of a little bit of a mixed picture, but awareness is definitely growing nationally of what the right things to do are. And then once you're aware, are you selecting the right tools? And then once you've selected the right tool, are you using it as it's supposed to be used? There's those kind of 3 different levels we look at.
Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, what is the overall aim? When we think about effective revision, what does effective mean? Is it the idea that you can recall information quickly, you can apply it? Is it all those things? Like, let's start at the end first, and we'll work our way back with actual strategies. But to you, what does the end point of this word effective actually mean?
That's a great question. I think for me, it probably boils down to 2 main, I guess, metrics. One is the final, frankly, exam score, the final test grade, whatever level you're at. So, a lot of my sort of work is sort of focused on students preparing for their GCSEs or A-level exams. So ultimately, what is your attainment at the end of the day? My sort of wider philosophy is I kind of leave it to others to debate the merits of the exam system and how we should be tackling it all. My interest is the system is what it is today, and I want to help people do as well as possible in the system that exists. So there's kind of how you do in the exam. And then the second metric I'm really interested in is the efficient use of time in the run-up to the exam. So are you able to achieve well in a time-efficient way? So save yourself some time in pursuit of doing well. So you're kind of not having to stay up all night and pull big all-nighters and burn the midnight oil, having to spend hours and hours and hours buried in your books. You're able to do really well and achieve your potential, but in a time-efficient way. So you've got good work-life balance, good for well-being, and so forth. Those are the 2 things I look at.
Yeah. So what is the most effective revision? What would you say are the key principles that we can explore for students to know about?
Yeah. So I think there's two big things, and as I say, I'm sure there'll be familiar ideas to many of your listeners, Dave. But the two things I always really want any student to know. So kind of 80-20 principle. What's the sort of 20% of the science that will give us kind of 80% of the results? And these two things are really kind of where I focus. These are really, I want to spend kind of the vast majority of our time getting these right and getting these really, really good with learners. Once we kind of got these two things in place, we can kind of go off and explore other things and layer that on top. But let's get these two things in place first. And they are, firstly, retrieval practice. We've mentioned that before. That's the idea of testing yourself, as I'm sure many will know. So not taking information in from the environment through one of your senses, but rather trying to recall information, pull it back from your long-term memory back into working memory. So anytime you're quizzing yourself, testing yourself, trying to recall something, that's retrieval practice. Many teachers now try and incorporate retrieval practice into their classroom. So what we're saying here is we want to apply the same idea to revision too, for the same reasons. We want our students, the more of their revision time they're spending testing themselves, doing the retrieval practice, the more effective they will be. So there's the retrieval practice. And then the second idea we want to combine that with is the idea of spaced learning, or spaced repetition. So not just doing the test once, but repeating it at time intervals. And the magic really happens when we combine those two ideas together. So they're not sort of separate principles that sort of exist and float around in a vacuum. They really go hand in hand. And what we're looking for then is spaced retrieval practice. That is to say, we want to be doing the testing. The test is the memory workout, and we want to repeat that multiple times, spaced out at time intervals. That really is the gold standard approach to learning. And as I say, there's a fair bit we can kind of get into in terms of the practical details of actually how you go about doing that. But that at its core is the kind of two bits of core science. I think it's really important for any reviser to understand.
And what's the cognitive science behind that? Is it the idea that your brain is basically having to work really hard to recall? The more you work it, the more you're trying to retrieve older knowledge without just going back to your notes. The harder it works, the more you're embedding and making those links in your long-term memory that you can retrieve. Is that the idea behind it? Have I got that right?
So, I mean, there's this interesting disconnect, also almost disconnect between the world of psychology and the world of neuroscience. So the world of psychology is kind of all about the effects we see. So we're exploring how the brain works by doing experiments to sort of almost like from the outside in figure out, okay, well, these might be the sort of mechanisms that are going on in the brain. So when it comes to retrieval practice, the sorts of experiments a psychologist will do are, let's get a bunch of students in a room, split them down the middle, tell one half to do retrieval practice and tell the other half to do rereading, and let's compare their test scores. So we run those kinds of experiments and we see, lo and behold, retrieval practice is stonkingly powerful, and it outshines, really kind of any other approach to learning, often by quite a substantial testing effect, quite a substantial effect size in the experiments. So that's sort of what psychologists are up to, and I identify more with the sort of psychologist community. That was my academic background. There's this kind of layer of neuroscience that sits underneath it, and kind of neuroscientists are kind of they're interested in the chemistry and the neurotransmitters and the wiring, the kind of electrics of the brain, and how the neurons talk to each other. And typically what happens is the psychology tends to run a bit ahead of the neuroscience. It's easier and quicker to kind of figure out the experiment effects kind of experimentally than it is to figure out, well, okay, like what exactly is it at the neural level that is kind of going on when we are building a new memory. Even so, we had this big search in neuroscience in pursuit of the engram. Or the engram was the kind of the neural basis for memory. So neuroscientists were looking for, like, can we actually like at the level of the neurons, can we actually see what's going on when you learn something new? And doing that kind of research was really hard. It took a really long time to start to be able to, we now think we can point to engrams, and we've got really cool experimental ways to sort of show them up. And the engram is a permanent physical or chemical change in a circuit of neurons that codes for a specific idea. Okay, so that is basically when you learn a new fact, you form a new engram in your brain. There's a new little neural circuit that gets built. Is a sort of nutshell of what we're talking about here. But I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of being able to say we know why retrieval practice helps you build engrams faster. I think we'll get there, but it's quite hard research to do when you're kind of doing research on the brain like that.
We essentially know it works. We're not exactly sure why it works. Is that sort of the have I got that right in a sense? Like, we know it works, but we're not exactly sure what's going on in the brain that makes it work exactly.
I think that's probably a fair summary.
So one of the things I've read that you've written about, which I find really interesting, is the Ebbinghaus, I hope I've pronounced that right, forgetting curve. Can you explain that to our listeners, what exactly it is and how it plays a role in these revision techniques that you have done research on and show that work?
Yeah, sure. So the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is all about the spaced learning effect. So this is the sort of classic bit of psychology that kind of underpins the idea of the spacing effect, and that we just wanted to kind of do something once, we want to repeat it at time intervals. So Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist, and in sort of 1885, 1886, which is prehistory, by the way, for psychology research. Like 1885 is like way before most psychology was being done. Like most psychology we've sort of done in the last 100 years, maybe 50 years. Anyway, back in 1885, he was doing these experiments, not very scientifically, sample size of 1. He was just doing them on himself. And he was trying to get himself to learn these little triplets of letters. Was his sort of the material he was trying to memorize. So these big strings of kind of random 3-letter acronyms, basically. And so he was finding that his memory, his ability to recall this stuff, faded away relatively quickly. So we all kind of instinctively know this to be true, right? Like, it's far easier to remember something that you only just heard compared to something you heard last week, compared to something you heard last year. Right? It's intuition we all have quite strongly. And really kind of what we're looking to do to sort of join this back into the retrieval practice, and to join the spacing back in with the retrieval, like kind of the gold standard, what we really want to do for best retrieval learning of all is we kind of want to do the retrieval just at the moment where it's kind of about to fall off the cliff, just before it's about to be forgotten. So it gets increasingly difficult and effortful to recall something as that time passes. And the best moment to retrieve it of all, the sort of optimum moment to retrieve it of all, is kind of that moment just before you're about to forget it entirely. So it'll probably be quite hard to recall it in that moment. But if you succeed, that's a beautiful bit of retrieval practice, and will really help strengthen that memory.
Cool. So we're going to go to our first ad break. When we come back, I'm really interested in getting to the actual practical elements of this. So let's go to our first ad, then we'll come back and be speaking to William a bit more about this.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Kapow Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to kapowprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
And we're back. So, William, let's go with an example. I'm a history teacher. So I've taught, well, let's think of the last topic I taught. I taught culture in West Germany. So my students have learnt culture in West Germany. So they've embedded, I hope they've understood it. Then when would they start to bring in, you're saying that they should wait then a few weeks until they start to forget before they come back to it. How would revision then work, let's say over a week? Their exam on that particular topic won't be until May next year. So how would it sort of work, if I can ask you that, over a sequence of, say, they learnt it 3 weeks ago, their exams in May next year, probably around the 22nd of May, if it's anything like this year. What would you sort of set out as a process?
Cool. So there's a couple of things to say here. So the first one is, one of the common questions I get when I'm sort of doing a talk for teachers is someone will often ask, what is kind of the optimum spacing schedule? Okay, like, so, what does the science say is the kind of the magic into, is it like you do 3 days later and then 2 weeks after that and then 6, like what's the kind of, like we surely research that. We surely know the answer to that. And I think we don't know the answer to that. And there can never really be an answer to that for two reasons. One is individual difference. The rate at which I forget something will be a little bit different to you. And that depends on all sorts of factors, including, maybe for me, I'm kind of vaguely familiar with an idea from before, or, maybe I paid slightly more attention at that moment you were talking about it in class, Dave. Or maybe, I'd joined the dots and kind of connected that bit into a prior bit of knowledge a bit more effectively. So it just sticks a bit better in my brain, it just happens to, than the guy sat next to me. So there's individual difference, but then, for me, within all the different bits of, knowledge that you imparted on culture in West Germany, I'll forget those individual points at different rates as well. So, some bits are harder to learn than others. So typically information that is, quite abstract, like a date, is quite quickly forgotten, quite difficult to remember, compared to something that, maybe there's a particular character in West Germany that has the same name as my best friend or something, in which case I'd remember that really well, because I'd be able to think, oh, it's my best friend's name. I'll remember that really easily. Someone with quite an obscure name that I'd never come across before will be forgotten much more quickly. So there's these kind of, like, we forget at different rates. So there's no kind of one magic, like, set of intervals. An analogy I've used before to describe this is it's a little bit like, your goal is to build a strong muscle. So you want to go to the gym and build strong muscle. In a way, what we're doing when we're building memory is sort of thinking about as building memory muscle, right? So, we're kind of in the gym, we're trying to build strong muscle. Someone asks you, okay, well, what's the research say about the optimum amount of weight to put on the bar? So when you're lifting a dumbbell, what's the research-based, the evidence-based number of weights to put on the bar? And of course, that's going to be different for everybody. Because everyone's at different points in their strength building journey. I'm quite early on in my strength building journey, so I don't need very many weights on the bar for it to be quite effortful for me to lift. You might have been working out for 5 years by now, and so you can take quite a bit of weight on the bar. And if you kind of do some research to find that optimum level, then what you've really done is just kind of averaged, taken an average across lots of different individual needs. And, you kind of end up with, an average number, which is too heavy for some people to lift and too easy for other people to lift. So there's this kind of optimum desirable difficulty that, is, really the kind of the best way to think about it is, rather than there being kind of an optimum amount of time, it's really about this kind of optimum level of difficulty. What we're aiming to do is revisit that idea, retest that idea far enough into the future after it starts to get a little bit effortful to recall, but before it becomes impossible to remember. So if I just ask people to think about this while you're listening, think about what you had for breakfast this morning. For most people, that's relatively quick to recall. And then think about what you had for dinner. We're recording this on June 27th. Think about what you had for dinner on May 27th, so a month ago, or subtract 30 days from whenever you listen to the replay, if you're on the replay. For most people, that's too long ago. We've forgotten that specific detail 30 days previously. And then try thinking about what you had for lunch 2 days ago. And just try really searching your memory for that. I don't know, Dave, can you remember?
I have to admit that I have the same thing for lunch every day, Will. So it's very
That makes it
easy.
easy. That makes it easy.
I'm a bit strange like that, but yes, because it's the
So-
same thing I had today. But
so-
I'm guessing for most people it's different.
Yeah. So the majority of people can get the breakfast today. They can get the lunch 2 days ago. Most people can't get the dinner a month ago. But the interesting difference between the breakfast and the lunch is very effortful. Most people don't get that instantly, unless, like you, Dave, they have the same thing every single day. But the lunch is effortful. I look around the room and I'll see faces screwed up, and you're kind of thinking about it, and then suddenly you get that flash of inspiration. Oh yeah, it was there. Yeah, well, okay. So that's kind of what we're like. The best retrieval practice of all, that's kind of the effect we're looking for. It's more of a level of difficulty that we're looking for, rather than an optimum amount of time, if that makes sense. And the amount of time is like a lever we can use to make things easier or harder, depending on the needs. So in the context of, you're a teacher and you're trying to think about how you want to structure your retrieval practice, or how you want to kind of recommend your students structure their retrieval practice, we're looking for sort of a rule of thumb. If we're just doing a retrieval practice, say we're doing a retrieval practice quiz in a lesson, or going for a set of flashcards as an independent learner, if you're just breezing through every single question or every single flashcard and kind of getting 100% right, no effort, no sweat, that's a sign you could maybe be spacing more. You've probably done it too soon. You could come back to it a few days later or next week, and make it a little bit harder for yourself. If you are, on the other hand, maybe say getting less than 50% on your questions or on your flashcards, that's a sign that you are, your spacing's maybe gone a little wide, and we might want to repeat a little more frequently. So for those familiar with Rosenstein's principles, he talks about like an 80% rule of thumb as sort of what you want to be aiming for in terms of attainment. And I think that's not a bad guide here. I think we can probably be a little bit wide, I suppose, 60, 70%, or less. We probably want to space a bit, come back to it a bit more frequently. If you're kind of up to 95% plus, you want to kind of come back to things. You can probably afford to push things out a little bit, give yourself a bit more challenge by spacing more. So if you're the teacher setting that kind of retrieval, doing 5 questions, starter questions, retrieval 5 questions to start the lesson, and everybody's getting them all right, and you've been testing what you did last lesson, then maybe bring in some from, maybe do 3 questions from last lesson, 1 question from the lesson before, and then 1 question from a couple of weeks ago, and then see how people get on with that. And if they still can handle it, then maybe bring in some questions from even further ago still. So you keep moving it out until you get to that point where people can't handle it and the attainment starts to tank. So we've talked about this idea of desirable difficulty and kind of using spacing as like this modulator of retrieval difficulty. That's one really powerful thing to think about. And then just briefly, the other thing that's really important to mention in terms of like how we structure our spacing is I'm a pragmatist. I'm very much, how do we make this work in the real world? And so what I sort of take interest in is when do we have opportunity to do the retrieval? When are those little windows in either our teaching routine or our kind of routine as an independent learner? When are those kind of windows that present themselves? And then what can we be doing in those windows? So we're kind of integrating it. We're starting with our routine. We're starting with what's available. And then we're thinking about the most effective way to use it. So for example, for a learner, we just had GCSE A-level season, Easter holidays. I'll often say to learners, okay, start of each day, let's use your first study block of the day, your first revision session of the day. Let's use that first block of the day and let's test ourselves on what we did yesterday. And then let's maybe save maybe a day each week. And whatever revision you're doing that day, let's test ourselves on everything we've done that week. So by the end of the week, you've gone through everything once, twice. You did 2 rounds of spaced repetition. 1, your first block of the next day, and 1 again at the end of the week when you have your recap day and you test yourself on everything you've done that week. And this works well because it's very much rooted in kind of what's easy to implement. You're not having to have some kind of messy, complicated spreadsheet of all these different dates you did the topic for the first time when you come back to it the second time. No, you just know that the first period of each day, you test what you did yesterday, and then you pick a day each week and you test everything you did that week. You don't even need to write that down. You kind of already internalized that. So, it makes the spacing happen kind of within your routine. It makes it kind of happen almost on autopilot within your routine rather than having to have any kind of complex plan, which, I don't like plans when they get complex because they don't happen. So, yeah. Big question there, Dave, and I hope that was helpful in shining some light.
Yeah, no, 100%. I've got a couple of questions before we go to the news and bring Dale in. I guess one of the things I try and push with my students, they can be a little bit resistant to it, is dual coding. How effective do you think dual coding is, and how do you think it's best utilized?
Honestly, I think that would be a great question to ask Dale, because I think he talks to his students about dual coding. And my view is that I'm really excited to get students doing the retrieval and doing the spacing. And it's a rare student that is doing all of this really well, to my sort of satisfaction. And so, we have limited input time with learners in terms of our kind of ability to offer direct instruction on how they go about their studying. And my experience has been that sort of focusing that input on doing retrieval well, doing spacing well. There's a huge amount of detail with retrieval. I wrote 10,000 words the other day on how to do a good flashcard. I mean, literally, like, there is a lot of detail on this, and kind of it's that kind of level of detail I'm kind of really interested in. So there are these kind of other things. So there's things like interleaving, dual coding, cognitive load theory. Like, desirable difficulty I've already kind of brought in via space learning. And I think if there was like another tool I would add as kind of the next most helpful thing after we've done the big two of retrieval and spacing, it would probably be interleaving. I really like interleaving as a specific tool for practicing maths style problems, particularly. Where we're kind of alternating our practice of two related kinds of question and juxtaposing that kind of problem type A, problem type B, doing one of each in turn. That is very powerful and a really, really useful tool. But it's got that kind of specificity. It's not kind of that general applicability to pretty much anything in the curriculum. It's that specificity of, okay, you're practicing some kind of skill, you're practicing some kind of problem. So yeah, interleaving is kind of my third favorite, but it's quite a distant third favorite. I think understanding desirable difficulty, I think understanding cognitive load theory can be helpful for sort of more advanced learners. If you really want to kind of play with things, then you can get into dual coding, mnemonics, all sorts of other fun things. But my strong recommendation to kind of the vast majority of teachers trying to help their students get on board with this is, let's start by getting spacing and retrieval right, and focus there. Don't get carried away too soon.
Well, my final question at this stage was going to be about flashcards, but if you've written 10,000 words, I was hoping for a quite a sort of quick answer. But I guess as a teacher, I'm always concerned that some students spend too long making their flashcards look amazing, and don't actually focus on what they should be doing. So the optimal flashcard is what? Like quizzes, just knowledge, you're using it to test yourself. It doesn't have to look fancy. Is that the basic sort of idea with it, William?
Absolutely, yeah. Look, I'll give you 3 or 4 bullets. So we're looking for a clear front and back. Like, that sounds obvious to you and me, probably, but it's not always obvious to learners. Like, we've got a question on the front, we've got an answer on the back. We don't need full sentences unless we are learning a specific quote or a specific phrasing of a definition matters. We can boil the language down to its bare essence. We want to have 1 point per card. Trying to sort of atomize knowledge so we have discrete ideas on each card. So I'll see a lot of learners and looking at their flashcards, they basically look like they've written notes. They've written summary notes. It just happens to be on a small piece of paper. That's not quite the point with flashcards. Flashcards belongs to the cued recall family of retrieval strategies, where we want to be testing ourselves on just those kind of individual nuggets, those individual points in turn. So split it up, have lots of cards, each of which doesn't have very much written on it. And as your point, Dave, as you're saying, Dave, very, very, very wisely, we want to aim to get through the making process quickly. So don't go to town on making them super, super neat and colourful. This is another reason, by the way, I hesitate with dual coding, because I think some learners get carried away with sort of illustrating everything they do and taking a ton of time to make their revision resources. So we want to make our revision resources quickly, whether it's a flashcard, whether it's something else, so we get onto the testing as soon as possible, because that is ultimately where the real value is. Yeah. So just a few cliff notes.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. So it's been fantastic talking to you, William. We're going to go to the news. When we come back, we'll be speaking to Dale Banham about how he's put William's research and advice into practice at his particular school. And then we'll be talking to William and Dale together as we get nearer the end of the show. So stay tuned. If you've got any questions for William or Dale later on, please send them through. We'd love to hear from you.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Charity Speech and Language UK, which says children struggling with their speech are at a greater risk of developing mental health problems like anxiety and depression. According to the news website, the charity says almost 1/2 of all young people referred to mental health services are also dealing with serious speech and language challenges. These can include difficulties with learning new words, understanding non-verbal cues, or stammering during speech. The government says it will ensure thousands more children receive help they need to overcome challenges with communication through its plan for change. According to the charity, around 2 million children in the UK are experiencing issues with their speech and language. 1 in 5 children and young people aged 8 to 25 experienced a mental health problem in 2023, according to the NHS. The Chief Executive of Speech and Language UK said, children who struggle with talking and understanding words are more likely to develop poor mental health. The charity wants better training in speech and language for teachers and school support staff, as well as mental health professionals, and better information sharing between schools and mental health teams to spot language issues in children at an early age. In a joint report with the Centre for Mental Health, the authors call for schools and mental health teams to move away from a reliance on talking-based therapies, adding that solutions like art therapy could sometimes be more appropriate. Full details, comment from those affected by speech and language difficulties, and further government response can be found on the BBC News website in the Family and Education section. Schools Week covers a new report which says internal alternative provision in schools risk becoming costly holding pens because there is a lack of guidance and oversight. The report by The Difference says the units could unintentionally reinforce cycles of exclusion. The charity goes on to say a growing number of English schools are setting up internal AP for pupils struggling in the classroom as they grapple with what the report describes as the crisis of lost learning. For many schools, an internal AP aims to provide an on-site support for pupils and reintegrate them into mainstream. But The Difference, which works to prevent exclusions in schools, said a lack of clear guidance means some are unintentionally causing harm. According to the report, the expansion of internal APs is part of schools' attempts to get a grip on record rates of exclusions, absences, and an escalating number of children with special educational needs. However, it goes on to say there is little guidance on what good practice looks like, and no clear figures for how many schools have such units. The research points to the latest government figures showing 93,700, or 5.6%, more children were identified with SEND last academic year compared to the previous year. This includes over 34,000 more children with social, emotional and mental health difficulties. The report says internal AP is becoming the norm, but that schools are often navigating this important work in the dark. Without the right support, it says, there is a risk they end up inadvertently creating an exclusionary space. The Difference has now published best practice guidance saying the internal APs should not be seen as a place to fix the child, and real success is more likely if provision is underpinned by strong whole school inclusion. Full details, including comment from school leaders and AP leaders, can be found on the Schools Week news feed. Schools Week also features an article which says a recent study by the NFER could show that teacher retention payments are not as effective as first thought. According to the study, some teacher retention payments made no difference to retention rates, but the NFER says the payment should still be used, but as part of a wider strategy. The research was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it examined the effectiveness of 5 different government schemes piloted since 2018 and aimed at improving teacher retention with financial incentives for early career teachers. The schemes evaluated included the maths and physics retention payments, teacher student loan reimbursement and early career payments, as well as others. Each of the schemes provided additional payments to teachers in shortage secondary subjects, with direct payments for teachers in the first 5 years and loan reimbursements paid to those in their first 10 years. Previous studies have suggested positive impact from retention payments, but NFER said its new analysis shows weaker and often not statistically significant improvements in teacher retention. NFER said its findings show retention payments should be carefully targeted and used alongside high bursaries to get best value. They also called for government to gather more evidence on the impact in recruitment and retention interventions. More details and government and union responses can be found online. Finally, a rebuilt infant school in Leicester is now one of the UK's first carbon-neutral schools, according to the Department for Education. Built as part of the school rebuilding programme, the £14 million project included heat pumps, solar panels, heat recovery and wind catchers. The school will create more energy than it needs in the summer, according to builders. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
And we're back. Thanks so much, Joe. Lots of interesting stuff to get your teeth into there. And if you're interested in debate over any of those topics or in education, make sure to tune in to Points of View on a Sunday morning. Okay, so my next guest is Dale Banham, who's been working a lot in his institute with William on these aspects of revision. So hopefully he is there. Dale, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you well, Dave. Cheers.
Awesome. So, welcome. So, can you just tell our listeners about your background, where you work, what sort of teaching you're doing, how you came to be about interested in William's research? Just sort of set the scene for us.
Yeah, so like you, started off as a history teacher, then head of humanities, did a bit of advisory work, and then last 15 years have been deputy head at a large comprehensive in the middle of Ipswich. So I think in my role as a deputy head, I was in charge of the curriculum, teacher development, teaching and learning. And William's work seemed to be perfect because, you know, as all your listeners will know, it's very hard to get whole school CPD right. And William's work, I think, every department can buy into, and that was certainly the case in our school. Also, I was very keen to explore something that wasn't just going to be a one-off and, you know, constantly jumping around as a keen, you know, expert in teaching and learning, saying, right, this week we're looking at this, the next week we're going to look at this. I think the beauty of William's work is that it needs to be built and it evolves, and that might take 2 or 3 years. So it's very attractive to me as a deputy head teacher, but also as a teaching deputy head teacher. I've always taught GCSE and A level. This year, I've stepped down from the deputy head role and doing a lot more teacher training and history consultancy work. So, now as a history teacher, really invested in making William's ideas really work effectively in my discipline, because I do think subjects are obviously different, and some of the ideas would work differently in depending on the curriculum area.
So how long have you were just saying about the years of CPD, how long have you been working with William on these aspects of provision?
5 years. So
5 years. Okay. Wow.
no, seriously, I think this is a really key point for listeners. I go into a lot of schools. I've seen a lot of schools, and people are constantly changing the teaching and learning focus. The bottom line is, for something as William said, that the two essential ideas: regular retrieval practice, how to do that effectively, and then maybe the more complex idea of getting spacing right. I mean, they're so fundamental to all learning. That I think you've got to say to your staff, we're going to focus on this for the next 3 years, which we did. We started with GCSE and A level, and then gradually over time, like William said, play around with different things, move it into Key Stage 3 because it's just as important there, and give departments time to immerse themselves in this. I honestly can't think of a more important teaching and learning initiative. Like lots of you listeners, when I read Make It Stick, I thought, I really wish I'd read that 20 years ago. I'd always prided myself in, engaging lessons, loads of students opting for history. But I think maybe, my own experience as a learner, certainly, I was always told what to learn, but not how.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, Dale. You've obviously been teaching a long time. Do you have any sense of why there's been more interest in this? Is it just that the research out there, the stuff that William is doing, is better? Have people sort of come to it a bit more? Like, what would you say is it's not a turning point, but what is it that has really made us focus on more about how students revise as opposed to what you need to revise?
Yeah, I like how you can't stop being a history teacher until you mention the word turning point. I basically I come back to being a history teacher or a scientist as evidence. It works, and I think that's why it's become such a big thing. You literally can see a student who has been really, really struggling transformed. I think that idea of, motivation is really interesting. I've always felt motivation comes from success, and that idea of any student can adopt these ideas, and if they stick with them, because they are tough, they work. Similarly, with any teacher can use these. That these ideas don't cost anything. It's not about, as a teacher, having to work loads and loads harder. And the same message for the students as well. So I do think, you seem quite surprised we've spent kind of like 5 years on this, but it needed that amount of time, I feel. And we were seeing progress year on year. Certainly, as a history department, we really invested in this early doors, but then across the whole school. So I think that's probably why it's that kind of idea that really seems to be sticking at the moment. I've always felt that, as a subject specialist and as a deputy head, that kind of sense of frustration, what's going to be the next big idea. This one's not going away.
Yeah. No, I was surprised in a good way, because I think about so many places I know of, and I'm not going to name any of them, but it is that, we started on this, but let's bring this in or bring this in. I think it's quite amazing and a fantastic thing that you have been able at your institute to say, this is what we're going to look at for 5 years without jumping from this to that to this to that. I think so many listeners who are teachers would be thinking, well, my institute started with one thing, but then they were like, oh no, this sounds good, or move to this one. So I think it's that consistency. Just before we talk about what's been effective with your students, can you just set the scene? So your institute, the school you work at, it's a pretty standard, comprehensive, students of all sort of abilities,
Yeah,
going
yes.
from 11 to 18?
Yeah, 11 to 18, 1,800 students. Yeah, bang in the middle of a town, a very large town with a very famous football team. I mean, going back to your original point though, is that I think what really brought me to Williams stuff is that there is so much out there, and I read Make It Stick, and I was also heavily influenced by like the learning scientists were doing some brilliant work, but Williams managed to kind of synthesize it all. I know you've looked at his material as well, and that was really, really attractive. And then having someone with that credibility, who's clearly bringing the expert to talk about why this works as well, was really important for me. But I suppose the biggest attraction as a historian who has has to have ideas grounded in considerable substantial evidence, was the revision census. We'd spent far too long, and I'd spent too long thinking that I knew how my students were revising. The revision census allowed us to actually find out how they actually were revising, and then compare ourselves year on year in terms of were more students using the right methods, and comparing ourselves against other schools who were doing the survey, and actually being able to really drill down and pinpoint individual pupils or year groups or sections of year groups, to be able to drill down and look at, it's quite interesting. We got the hang of flashcards with Williams' help pretty quickly, but blank page retrieval and mind mapping was really interesting. And every year, the census threw up an area where we weren't quite getting it right as staff. And I say staff deliberately because the census shows that students weren't using the methods in the right way. It's our responsibility as a member of staff to teach them those right methods in all subjects.
Yeah. Let's talk about practicalities. How do you roll that out? I'm assuming it's not just William comes, talks to, I don't know, an assembly, we start doing it. So just, I think if I'm a teacher listening tonight, I'm thinking, that sounds awesome. Where do I even start? Like, did you start with small groups? How did you even begin this process, Dale?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think totally the opposite to let's get an expert in. They do a one-off presentation and then magically everyone's meant to do it. They're measured against it in their performance management, and then the next year it's something else. We deliberately kind of started with teachers who are interested in research. So we set up an action research group, which later evolved into a massive group that normally nearly involved 50% of the staff. So that was really important because the action research group allowed teachers to fail or to say that didn't work in my subject, and to go back to things. And like I said, the ideas evolved. Also, I think that spread it out to departments. So there was always someone who was a champion for the kind of retrieval, space practice, dual coding methods within every single department. So yeah, that idea of starting with an action research group and growing it, the second year was, I suppose, a little bit more bullish as in terms of, look, we really know this works. We want all departments working on it. I think also similarly, a real key learning point is you've got to get parents on board as well. So we did a heck of a lot of work with parents explaining why we were doing what we were doing, particularly with things like homework, where because of the spacing effect, lots of departments were spacing their homework and taking students back to things. So their homework wasn't based on what they'd just done in the lesson. Which seemed weird for parents who'd been brought up. Homework is, either in preparation for the next lesson or on what you've just done. Our homework was on taking them back to stuff that they'd done 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, and in the case of our GCSE and A-level students, a year ago.
So just to go back over that with the action research. So I guess what you're saying is you look for volunteers first, people who are interested. So you get them involved as almost champions, and then you're expanding it out. And the action research, that part was about a year. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's exactly like, any kind of movement grows. I mean, I think of the really highly successful anti-slavery movement in Britain started with 12 people meeting in London, and then 20 years later, the British slave trade was ended. I mean, any successful thing, I think, for me, grows from the bottom up. And if you don't have the engagement of the pupils, the parents, and your staff, you can get as many experts in as you want, but people have got to believe it works. So the teachers and pupils and students. And I think also, it's no good delivering this in one-off assemblies. A deputy head walks into an assembly and tells people how they should be revising. It's got to grow from within departments. There's got to be a consistent language, and I think having someone like William in that really, really helps. We did a lot more, and I think this is another key thing, explaining to students why we were doing what we were doing. So not just having kind of those old school lesson objectives of, this is what we're going to be doing and how, but this is why we're doing it this way.
Did you get much into the science of it? Like, when you say that, how did you explain to students this works? Was it a cognitive science? Did you talk to them about the research and say, hey, this is the background to it? What did you actually do for your students?
Yeah, I think once again, that was the great thing about William coming in. He had some really nice slides that even for me as a historian summed up the science really effectively, using dual coding, using diagrams, but also showing effect sizes is really, really powerful. So yeah, I think explaining that to students, and also William helped us with this as well. I think too many schools, when they get exam results, you immediately, because you're teachers and we care, you try and look at the pupils who haven't done very well, and then you call back their papers and you try and find out, if, in a sense, what went wrong. We shifted our focus to actually think, how the heck did that student achieve that result? And we spent a lot of time talking to them, and William helped us interview them. We made videos, and then we got those students who were in our sixth form, who really had transformed their grades between years 10 and 11. I mean, really transformed it, like going up from grade 2 to grade 6, for example. We got them in front of assemblies, talking to the pupils. I also, in the last couple of years, we set up a group, an intervention group, which was led by older students, and colleagues did some really nice work where year 13s were helping year 12s study. But the year 13s found it really useful revision as well, because they had to go back over year 12 stuff. So I think the power of putting a student who can stand up and not say, oh, I'm a fantastic student, I've always got A stars or grade 8s and 9s, but to have a student in front of you to say, look, I was like you. I did my end of year exams in year 10 and I got a 2 in history. I'm now doing it A level because I got a 7. This is how I did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. So where did you target first? Was it at GCSE, or did you go GCSE and A level? Like, did you start? Where did you guys start?
Probably tried to do too much at first with GCSE and A level, but it really needed the work at GCSE. So I think we really focused first couple of years on GCSE, and then moved to A level. Because A level it's a little bit more nuanced. I'm a big fan of William's idea, which he did a brilliant session on with a load of A level students who were struggling, called memory journaling, which is really just 2 or 3 minutes the following day trying to remember what you did the previous lesson. So yeah, then we moved into that, and then recently, the last 18 months, I've been really trying to work in Key Stage 3 with maybe the more abstract ideas where there might be a little bit less evidence about if it works in all subjects, things like dual coding, mnemonics, acronyms, because I think I'm quite invested in that, and the power of stories, and looking at that whole stuff about how these memory masters remember stuff, and trying to look at some other, what I'd call kind of like a classic concept of marginal gains. How can we get dual coding to work alongside a mnemonic or a great story? So yeah, we've been working on that, and then very, very recently, really also trying to come back to maybe that idea of when you teach it the very first time, how do you actually encode really successfully? So yeah, there's more than enough to work on. If William can write 10,000 words on flashcards, the school could certainly spend 5 or 6 years looking at this as a theme. And actually, what we
Yeah.
found is we needed action research groups within the action research group. So some people got really into homework and what the lag should be between homework. Others got big time into dual coding, and actually first phase of teaching how to encode it. So there was always enough to keep it quite fresh, I feel. Teachers at
Yeah.
school might say it's completely different, but seeing the action research projects that they did, that body of work is really, really powerful.
And have you noticed any particular differences between GCSE and A level in terms of what worked and what didn't? Were they the same, or were there things that seemed to work for some reason better with GCSE and then better with A level? I guess it's subject specific as well.
Yeah, it is subject specific, and it's not an exact science, like William said. I mean, the basic message is retrieval and spacing works from, well, I know it works at Key Stage 2 as well, all the way up to A level. That's just for me a given. I think memory journaling works better at A level. I think at A level, especially in some subjects where you get those really big essays, I think the kind of like the mind mapping, but not open book mind mapping, where you're basically reframing your notes as a mind map, but actually having a master mind map that you regularly try to recreate from memory. Because I think at A level, certainly in my subject, history, it's all about making connections, and trying to recreate those connections is really, really important. So whereas perhaps at GCSE, flashcards were probably the biggie. A level, more nuanced. Past papers, a lot more past papers. I think also, Dave, that I've realised far too late that revision books are a waste of time because they go totally against William's messages. A lot of our students were buying revision books where basically they were relearning stuff that they already knew. So, I think the perfect revision book, the chapter should start with a set of questions, not a load of information, because you only should be reading that information if you don't know it. You'll only know if you don't know it if you do retrieval practice.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I guess what would you say was the biggest barriers your students faced? I mean, what were the things they put up and sort of
Yeah.
contended, or this works for me? What were the things that they sort of put in the way of this? Or how accepting were they, I guess?
I think the problem is people want instant success, and it's hard. At first it feels intuitively, it doesn't feel right. Well, why can't I just pick up this revision book and read it, or pick up my notes and read it, and it will stick? And it's also very nice to, it's that classic idea that we perhaps you perhaps enjoy, you feel more self-worth if you're kind of revising stuff that you already know, or practicing what you already know. So I think it is pushing students to kind of really hone in on testing themselves first. That was the real key thing that we needed to push. As soon as they started to get some success, and it isn't going to happen within a week, then yeah, they bought into it. So I think it's that idea once again of explaining to them why we're doing this, why it feels a bit difficult, and then over time, if they buy into those methods, it works.
Were there subjects where the take up or the effect was quicker than others, or would you say it was pretty even? Was there anything where it was like, oh, that's actually working pretty quickly while the subjects had a bit of a lag?
Yeah, I think subjects like maths, science, history, geography, languages. I think the design technology, where you've got to learn a lot of keywords, key information. I mean, English literature is another classic example where you have to learn quotes. Actually thinking carefully about what a good flashcard looks like. I think that's really important. I mean, as you and William have both said, it's not the making the flashcard, it's how you use them. I also think each department has thought really carefully about what the question should look like on the other side. So if you're trying to learn a quote, just simply learning a quote isn't enough, is it? It's got to be who said it, when, in the play or in the story, where were they, that sense of location, why is that quote important? There's a whole series of questions that contextualizes it. So getting the questions right for flashcards was really important.
Yeah. I mean, that's just what I was thinking about. I'm a history teacher. I guess if I was to play devil's advocate, I'm thinking this is all sounds fantastic. This would be great for recalling dates, for recalling knowledge. That's brilliant. How do I then go about, the practice and revision of application of that knowledge? Because obviously our students aren't doing pub quizzes. They're having to answer quite difficult questions.
Right.
What's the sort of step there in terms of the revision and how you've been working with William?
Yeah, you're quite right. And I don't mind you playing devil's advocate. I mean, in terms of most subjects, I mean, for me, history is about three things. It's about memory, argument, and then communication. So there's those three elements, and simply remembering a lot, won't get you perhaps into the grade 6s and 7s, but it's the absolutely fundamental first step for nearly all subjects in the curriculum. And creativity, complex thinking doesn't happen in a vacuum. As we all know, you need to know a lot to be able to do that. So it was a fundamental thing that we did. But once you've made your flashcards and you've got them there sitting in front of you, William is also a massive advocate of past paper practice questions. Not necessarily writing them out in full, although they do need to get obviously used to writing them to time, but planning them from memory. But also you can use your flashcards once you've got them out in front of you as a really quick way to do that crucial step, which some students at A-level and GCSE are very good at, where they just chuck everything in. What information should really go into that? And then your flashcards almost become a card sort, which the teacher hasn't had to chop up and laminate and spend hours and hours making, because the pupils can manipulate their flashcards. And I think that's very useful in terms of that idea of visible learning, because they can see, well, that might work and that could go in that question, but you wouldn't necessarily use it for this type of question. So there's lots of ways. Once you've got that fundamental building block of knowing stuff embedded, then you can go into the past paper practice, and that's absolutely crucial. I mean, it's one of the big effect sizes that Williams' research really pushes. But the basic first step is knowing some stuff, because if you go into using past paper questions too early, I think you're just setting pupils up to fail. Then you get demotivation, then they switch off, and then you're on it's hard to get back from that. So my advice would be to start simple, build a real sound, solid knowledge foundation, lots of low stakes quizzing. Once you're in that position, then you bring in your past paper questions and how to manipulate. But yeah, certainly for my subject, it's the fundamental building block, but it isn't it. You then build upon it with things like how to construct an argument, and then how to communicate through careful choice of language. But I'm also, I think, just as we can memorize substantive knowledge, we can also memorize disciplinary knowledge. So I think, it's still about knowledge building, that whole disciplinary approach.
So in terms of practicalities then, are you encouraging teachers to set certain lesson time for this? How would it work in, say, a scheme of work, in lesson planning? What is the actual practical element? I'm a teacher. I've got, I don't know, I teach 3 90-minute lessons a week for A level, but obviously different sort of settings have different aspects of it. Is it something at the end of the lesson, the start of the lesson? How do you build it in? Or is it just sort of, I don't know, like built within the whole structure? What's the practicalities of it?
Yeah, I think it's just got to be built in regularly. So it's no for me, it's no point if you've got 4 units in your exam, teaching unit 1, stopping and testing them on it, then teaching unit 2, and then only testing them on unit 2. By the time you get to unit 4, they'll certainly forgotten most of unit 1, 2, and 3. So I think it is that snowball effect, that idea of snowball revision. So your retrieval quizzes grow and constantly go back to previous knowledge. But I think there's also, really interesting work still to be done in terms of when you're teaching a piece of new content, how you find a meaningful and engaging way to revisit previous content, how you can make useful connections. I mean, that you'd never teach, I don't know, you would never teach, I know you teach fascist Italy. You'd never then go on to teach elements of other European history and not link back to their knowledge of fascist Italy. So I think there are lots of places within the curriculum where you can connect up, and I think that's a very difficult skill for a student to do, and that's where the teacher can make connections to meaningfully go back to previous content. But I do think it has definitely got to be planned in, and homework for me would be the key. So 90% plus of our homework is about going back to previous knowledge. Rarely is it about what we've just done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was just thinking about how do you sort of monitor this? Is it in learner walks that you're going around teachers saying this is what I'm going to be doing? Like at a whole school level, what is your role in terms of teaching and learning? Is it that sort of aspect you're looking for? How do you monitor this?
Yeah, I think the first step is to get consistency of language and getting all departments to buy into it. But once again, I'd come back to my approach. You don't get departments to buy into it by forcing them to do something that they don't believe in. So I think that first step has got to be done very carefully, and getting them to go and look at good practice in other areas, having forums where people can be honest about ideas and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and learn from colleagues, rather than a top-down imposed structure, which is, I'm going to go on to my kind of spreadsheet and I'm going to record people who are not setting regular retrieval practice style questions. It's exactly the same in any walk of life. I think it's making people believe that it works and buying into it is far bigger investment of time in that. I think also in terms of inset can be really effective when teachers sit and listen to student voice. So I mean, that's what the revision census gives you. It gives you a massive student voice about what they're doing, what they're finding difficult, etc., etc. But also, the interviews that William and I have done with students, we've played them back to staff. And when you sit there and you're listening to someone say, my results were absolutely transformed in subject X because they did this, this, and this. If you're sitting there listening as a teacher, you're thinking, I want some of that. I'm going to go and chat to that department, go and have a look at what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, that was my final question before we go to our last ad break and bring William back in, has been, what is the impact you've seen over the 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, this also does tie massively. I've been listening to the adverts and the news features as I've been sitting here. This ties massively into mental health, because it does genuinely help all students. It helps those students who spend far, far too long on revision, burning out and having serious mental health issues. For those students who never really have had a chance of success and say, I can't remember anything, it builds their self-confidence. So I think, there is links there to mental health, because it's not about, the boxer and Animal Farm, I must work harder, I must work harder. It is like, William said, it's about working smarter and using proven techniques and proven methods. So that aspect of it has been really successful. And notice I'm mentioning in that before any kind of mention of Progress 8, but it has improved our Progress 8 as well. So, but I do think in terms of, that idea of a way to, I mean, coming back to, you've only learned what you can remember. And yeah, it's scary to think of, if you teach your exam specification as a series of episodes and then think, yeah, my job's done. I've covered the specification. It isn't down to the teacher to cover the specification. It is the pupil has got to learn what's in the specification. And content coverage isn't the model to go down. It's this snowballed curriculum where we're constantly revisiting. And I think our big challenge as teachers is to not make that revisiting always quite a dull mechanical process, that 10 questions at the start of every lesson. I think that's important to do that very regularly. But there are also, which really interests me over the next 5 years, I think there's some fantastic ways we can revisit previous content in a really engaging way, where we're making connections between blocks of knowledge, and that basically relies on us really thinking carefully as subject leaders and subject teachers about what our core key takeaways of the curriculum are. So those are the ones that we regularly need to return to.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So let's go to our last ad break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to William and Dell together just for the last bit of the show.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Cool. And we are back for the last 8 minutes or so of the show. So we've got a few questions coming in. One of the first questions we had from one of our listeners was about how young you could start with this. Have you looked at Key Stage 2? I know, Dale, you said you've looked at Key Stage 3. I guess in terms of your research, first of all, William, how far back have you looked at student revision and the research on it?
Yeah. So the revision census is years 7 through 13. And so I always make the point that my sort of 5,000 or so teaching hours of study skills is all at secondary level. So it's all Key Stage, it's all Key Stage 3 and above. So that is the world I know very well. And I'd say that definitely, if they're not aware of some of these ideas by year 7, that is a great time to start that conversation and start to get them in those good habits early. One of the interesting things I've noticed in the census, particularly in recent years, is some of the year 7s coming through are now starting to have quite good ideas and sort of almost outperforming their older peers in older year groups. Do you know what I mean? And so kind of anecdotally from my conversation with the primary world, primary teachers are starting to get excited about this message at primary level as well now. It's not something I kind of have a lot of direct experience with, but I'd certainly suggest that, if you are at primary level, ways to start to introduce these ideas to students, obviously at an age appropriate level. I know some primary schools talk about, making knowledge sticky rather than talking about retrieval practice in terms of the terminology. I think that could potentially be a big win.
And what about you, Dale? You said you've started with Key Stage 3. Is that right? You've gone back to year 7s. How have they been with this sort of stuff, and how's it possibly been different?
I think it's absolutely crucial, and also kind of like playing around with dual coding and use of mnemonics and acronyms. I think that's used quite a lot in primary, and like you said, I think just like with writing, we really underestimate, perhaps when year sevens come in, how much they can remember and how good the memory methods they've got. Well, certainly, I spend probably a day a week at the moment in primary, mainly in Key Stage 2. And I think all of these principles that we're talking about are just as important there as well, in terms of, how to make knowledge stick. I mean, lots of primary schools are having those conversations as well.
That's really interesting. Have you worked with primary schools around you at all, Dale, or is it like?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously, so when you're dealing with, like with most subjects, we don't do no primary school does like a series of like one-off topics. You constantly want them to build a schema. So, for example, those big ideas. I mean, primary schools often talk about the golden threads of their curriculum. So, in history, a big kind of meta concept like, first order concept like empire. During primary, they're gonna study a lot of empires, and I think it's really, really important for them to be able to recall information about previous empires, so that by the end of the Key Stage 2, they've built up that schema about what is an empire, how does it work, why are they formed, why do some last longer than others, etc., etc.
And so the next question I've got is about metacognition. So I guess like the thinking about thinking. I mean, how do you draw pupils from the retrieval practice, like the practicalities of it, to understanding of their own metacognitions is one of the questions we've had. It's quite a complex one. William, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, well, I think the two things are quite closely related. Metacognition is usually defined as thinking about thinking. And of course, that's exactly what we're doing when we're talking to learners about their learning methods and how they're doing it and whether they could be more effective and which tools are appropriate for certain subjects. In a way, it's kind of all metacognition. And so I think the two are quite closely related. I've always found it interesting, by the way, that the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, in their teaching and learning toolkit, they don't actually have one on like study skills or revision skills specifically, which I think is bizarre. But they do have metacognition, which I think is where it's represented in their toolkit, and it's notable that it is the highest rated intervention in the whole toolkit by impact. So it's the only one that gets a +8 impact score, compared to something like homework is +5 or one-on-one tuition is also +5, just to kind of give you an idea of the magnitude. I think they're quite closely related concepts.
And what about your students, Dale? Do you talk much about that sort of aspect, or is it more just the practicalities? Just do it and we'll talk about sort of what you might be thinking about later, or do you get into that too much?
We don't personally. I don't mention metacognition, and it's not a big thing. But like William said, my understanding, there's lots of different definitions of metacognition. I would just go back to what William said. Let's get them thinking about retrieval practice and space learning. I think also metacognition, most teachers would naturally be covering that through their questioning, in terms of, all of us as teachers, we don't just kind of say, here's a question, give me the right answer. We're always unpicking, how, why, can you support that? But yeah, maybe we don't ask enough, when which I think has been a real success at my school, has been, how the heck did you remember all that? Share that with the rest of the class. And also getting pupils to reflect on why they do so well on certain tests, because sometimes it's because they're, as you know, absolutely engaged. They love the subject. That first phase of learning has been so great for them. But other times where then perhaps they've found it quite tough, but then they've performed well. I do think we could do more, getting them to reflect on why they've been successful. And certainly the interviewing that William and I have done has been absolutely fascinating. Lots of teachers who've sat on that have said it's some of the best CPD they've ever had, because we don't spend enough time listening to pupils about why they do well.
Hmm. Hmm. So we're coming to the end of the show. So final thoughts from both yourself, William and Dale. I guess if teachers listening, you could take one bit of advice from each of you. William, I'll start with you. I know it's a tricky question, but what would you say is like the one key piece you'd want teachers to get out of our show tonight?
Focus on getting your learners doing good spaced retrieval. Don't worry about too much else until they're doing that really well.
Fantastic. Dale?
Well, that was the one I was probably going to say. I think the biggest mistake I've made for far too many years is you finish your course, you do those, I'm thinking about now 2-3 months ago, we're all doing those intervention sessions and those revision classes. Don't start by filling them up with content that they might already know. Get them to start with a test and a quiz, work out where their gaps are, and then use William's methods to fill those gaps.
Thanks so much, guys. Particularly, I got to give a big shout out to Dale, who has skipped his wife's birthday to talk to us about revision and space practice. So a big thank you to you, Dale. I hope that was all right.
That makes me sound absolutely horrendous. She's actually on a night shift.
So happy birthday to Dale's wife if she's going to be listening to this later. And yeah, thanks so much, William and Dale. I really appreciate. I think this one definitely deserves a part 2. We've actually gone slightly over time, and I've still got a million questions I want to ask. So yeah, thanks so much, guys. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
And to all the listeners, that is my final show for this summer. I'll catch you all again in September. Have a great summer, everybody. Have a great summer, William and Dale. And thanks so much.
Cheers, thanks.